Every single leader who ever started a war believed it would be over quickly. Napoleon thought Russia would fall in weeks. Hitler gave the same order. But there's a mathematical reason, not a historical one, why they were always wrong. And it's a reason nobody talks about openly. There's an equation that makes escalation not just likely, but inevitable. By the end of this video, I'll show you exactly what that equation is, and why it doesn't just live in history books. It lives in your boardroom, your relationships, your arguments. Most people won't connect these dots. If you make it to the final minute, you'll understand something that generals and presidents have spent careers desperately trying to solve. Stay until the end. This is game theory number 2, the law of escalation. By the end, you'll know the precise mathematical mechanism that makes every war go further than anyone planned, and the one insight that's the only real way out. Before you can understand the law of escalation, you need to understand one thing about game theory. Every conflict begins with a single move, and that move is never neutral. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary sent Serbia an ultimatum. Serbia accepted 90% of the demands. Just one point was rejected. Within 37 days, the entire world was at war. That's not a story about politics. It's a story about game theory. Because the moment Austria-Hungary made its first move, the ultimatum, it set a chain reaction in motion that couldn't be stopped by rational thinking. It could only be responded to. First move signals intent, and once your intent is signaled, the other player has only two options: respond or yield. If they yield, you've established dominance. If they respond, escalation has begun. There is no third option. Game theorists call this a commitment device. The moment you make a credible first move, you've actually removed your own ability to back down without massive cost. What I'm about to show you next explains why that cost doesn't just grow. It compounds exponentially. Here's the trap. Once that first move is made, both players face what game theorists call the prisoner's dilemma. Here's how it works. Two players must choose, cooperate or defect. If both cooperate, both get a moderate reward. If one defects while the other cooperates, the defector wins big and the cooperator pays enormously. If both defect, both lose. The problem is, defecting always looks safer in the short run, because if you cooperate and the other side defects, you've lost everything. So rational actors, facing uncertainty about what the other side will do, choose to defect. Both of them, every time. Now apply that to two countries in a dispute. Both sides know that if they back down while the other escalates, they lose enormously. So both escalate, not because they want war, but because the math of the situation makes de-escalation look identical to surrender. If understanding the hidden logic behind every major conflict is the kind of content that changes how you see the world, hit like and subscribe, because we go deeper every single week. There's far more to uncover, but the prisoner's dilemma is just the beginning of the trap. The next mechanism is even more insidious, and it's built directly into how humans process loss. Here's where wars stop being about strategy and start being about psychology. In 1965, the United States committed its first major ground combat units to Vietnam. By 1967, military analysts inside the government were privately concluding that the war could not be won. The internal documents, later released as the Pentagon Papers, showed that senior decision-makers knew. And yet the war continued for 8 more years. Why? The sunk cost fallacy. Once you've paid a price, leaving feels like wasting everything you already spent. The United States had lost thousands of soldiers, spent billions of dollars, committed enormous political capital, and the logic that emerged wasn't what will achieve our goals. It was, we can't let those sacrifices have been for nothing. Sunk costs drive escalation. This is mathematically irrational. The money spent, the lives lost. Those are gone regardless of what happens next. The only rational question is, what is the best decision from this moment forward? But humans don't think that way. And so wars continue, not because victory is achievable, but because stopping feels like admitting that everything already paid was wasted. Rational? No. Universal? Completely. What happens when you combine the prisoner's dilemma with sunk cost psychology? You get what game theorists call a commitment spiral, and it's where this gets truly dark. In the 1980, political scientist Robert Axelrod ran one of the most famous experiments in game theory history. He invited theorists from around the world to submit strategies for repeated rounds of the prisoner's dilemma. Complex algorithms, sophisticated calculations, mathematical masterpieces. The winner was the simplest strategy submitted: tit for tat. Start by cooperating. Then do exactly what the other player just did. Cooperate, you cooperate back. Defect, you defect back. Simple, transparent, proportional, and it defeated every other strategy in the tournament. But here's what Axelrod's experiment also revealed, something that gets far less attention. Tit for tat is extremely stable in cooperation, but the moment it enters a defection loop, it cannot escape on its own. Player A defects, player B defects back, player A defects again, not out of aggression, but because player B just defected. Player B responds. Now both players are locked in permanent escalation, even though both would prefer to stop. The loop, only way to break a tit-for-tat death spiral, is for one player to unilaterally absorb a loss, to cooperate after being defected on. In military terms, that means accepting a cost without retaliating. In political terms, that means appearing weak, and no leader in history has found that easy to sell to their people. But what happens when both sides start adding extra punishment to each response? When every retaliation escalates just a little beyond the last, that's where the arms race begins. And it's the most terrifying demonstration of the law of escalation ever recorded. From 1945 to 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union built enough nuclear weapons to destroy every city on Earth multiple times over. Not because either side wanted to use them, but because the logic of escalation made stopping feel impossible. At its peak, the two superpowers held over 60,000 nuclear warheads between them. This is what game theorists call an escalation spiral. Each new weapon built by one side created an asymmetry, a perceived disadvantage for the other. That asymmetry had to be corrected, so they built more, which created a new asymmetry, which had to be corrected again. Neither side was trying to build the most weapons. Each side was just trying to avoid having fewer. The difference is critical. This wasn't aggression. It was defensive logic applied to an offensive tool, applied simultaneously by both players with no coordination possible. The result: both sides were objectively less safe with 60,000 warheads than they had been with one. But escalation logic made stopping unilaterally impossible, because stopping meant accepting the other side's advantage. The arms race ended not because of military genius. It ended because the Soviet economy collapsed under the strain of keeping pace. The spiral only stopped when one player ran out of chips entirely. That pattern has a name, and the name reveals something deeply uncomfortable about why leaders can never just admit they were wrong. Here's a dimension of the law of escalation that rarely gets discussed, and it might be the most important one. Leaders don't just face an external game against their enemies. They face an internal game against their own populations. Two games, one leader. When a war goes longer than planned, as it always does, the leader who started it faces a brutal choice: admit the miscalculation, which costs them political power, or escalate, which at least demonstrates resolve and delays accountability. Game theoretically, this is called a two-level game, and it creates a catastrophic incentive. The politically rational decision is to continue the war even when the strategic rational decision is to stop. The first casualty when war comes is truth. During World War I, British military planners knew by 1916 that the Western Front had become a catastrophic stalemate. The Battle of the Somme killed 57,000 British soldiers on its very first day, and yet the offensive continued for 4 months, not because the generals thought it was working, but because admitting failure had a higher political cost than continuing. Every additional day of war becomes a sunk cost that justifies the next day. This is why wars don't just go longer than planned. They go longer than anyone, including the people running them, believes is rational. What happens when this two-level game collides with a small, local conflict that nobody thinks will matter? That's where the law of escalation reveals its most dangerous face. World War I is the perfect laboratory for the law of escalation, not because it was the deadliest war in history, but because it was the war where everyone involved predicted a quick, clean conflict. Kaiser Wilhelm told his troops they'd be home before the leaves fall. French generals predicted 6 weeks. British planners thought it would be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years and killed 20 million people. Every prediction was catastrophically wrong, and wrong for exactly the reasons game theory predicts. When Austria-Hungary made its first move, the ultimatum, it triggered Germany's commitment. Germany's mobilization triggered France's. France's triggered Britain's. Each escalation was a rational tit-for-tat response to the previous one, each side adding extra punishment to the previous defection, each side carrying sunk costs that made backing down politically impossible. Nobody planned World War I. The Law of Escalation did. Historian Christopher Clark called it sleepwalking. Leaders moving forward in a fog, each step seeming rational in isolation, none of them able to see the catastrophic system they were building together. Rational steps, irrational outcome. This is the core paradox of the Law of Escalation. Every individual decision can be perfectly rational, and the collective result can still be catastrophic. But there's a deeper question that historians never fully answer. Is there a mathematical threshold, a specific point, after which de-escalation becomes literally impossible? Yes, and the answer is far more precise than you'd expect. Game theorists have a name for what happens when escalation becomes self-sustaining: the commitment trap. It's the point at which the cost of de-escalating, politically, militarily, economically, exceeds the cost of continuing. Once you cross that threshold, rational actors are actually rationally trapped into continuing a war they know they're losing. Trapped. The Vietnam War hit this point around 1967. The Soviet-Afghan War hit it by 1984. The first Gulf War avoided it. The second did not. Here's what makes the commitment trap so insidious. It's completely invisible when you're approaching it. No signal, no alarm. The escalation logic just continues, each step looking similar to the last. Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Game theorists have identified a measurable proxy for the commitment trap: when a conflict's total cost exceeds the value of the original objective, and leaders still cannot de-escalate. At this point, the conflict is no longer about what it started about. The goal that started the war disappears. Escalation becomes the goal itself, the original objective. The thing that seemed worth fighting for becomes irrelevant. The mechanism has taken over. And this is where I need to tell you something that most historians and game theorists miss entirely. Something that connects every war in history to a single, uncomfortable mathematical truth, and one that changes how you see every conflict in your own life right now. Here is the uncomfortable truth that game theory reveals about every war in history. The law of escalation is not a flaw in human judgment. It's the system. It's the natural output of a game where both players are rational, both face genuine uncertainty about the other's next move, and both face asymmetric costs for backing down. Given those conditions, escalation isn't an error. It's the predicted equilibrium. This is what Nobel Prize-winning economist Thomas Schelling called the dynamics of mutual alarm. Neither side is trying to start a full-scale war. Both sides are responding rationally to perceived threats, and the sum of those rational responses is catastrophe. The terrifying thing isn't that leaders are irrational. It's that they're perfectly rational, and it still ends in disaster. Schelling won the Nobel Prize for this work in 2005. His core insight: you cannot prevent escalation by appealing to rationality, because rational actors are the mechanism driving it. You can only prevent escalation by changing the structure of the game itself. Change the incentives. Change the cost of backing down. Don't wait for someone to make a noble, irrational choice to retreat. Change the game, not the player. A strange game. The only winning move is not to play. If this hit you somewhere real, if you've ever been inside an escalation you couldn't stop, share this with as many people as you possibly can. This truth is too important to keep to yourself. And tell me in the comments, was this genius or terrifying? I'll pin the best response. So here's the question that brings everything together. If escalation is mathematically inevitable, baked into the structure of rational decision-making, can it ever actually be stopped? Yes, but only in very specific ways. 1. Change the payoff structure. 2. Create credible off-ramps. 3. Introduce a mediator who rewrites the game. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the most famous example of a successfully avoided escalation spiral. The United States and the Soviet Union came within hours of nuclear war. What stopped it wasn't superior military strategy. It was back-channel communication, a secret channel that allowed both sides to de-escalate without publicly appearing to yield. Both sides needed to back down. Neither could afford to appear to back down. The solution was a structure that allowed both sides to frame retreat as something other than defeat. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove US missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev got what he needed without humiliation. That's not weakness. That's applied game theory genius. The most powerful move is often the one that makes it safe for the other side to stop. And that is the resolution to the question I opened this video with. Why does every war go further than anyone planned? Because the game structure makes every rational step forward look necessary, and every rational step backward look like surrender. The law of escalation doesn't need irrational actors. It only needs rational ones. Change the game or become it. The law of escalation is one of the most quietly terrifying ideas in all of game theory, not because it requires evil intentions, but because it requires none at all. Every leader who took a country to war genuinely believed, they were making the rational choice. Every step of escalation looked defensible in isolation, and yet the system produced catastrophe, again and again and again. War is the continuation of politics by other means, but Clausewitz missed the deeper truth that game theory reveals. Politics and war both run on the same escalation engine, the same prisoners' dilemmas, the same sunk cost traps, the same two-level games between leaders and their populations. The mechanism doesn't change when the stakes change. Only the consequences do. You've seen this in history, but if you look closely, you've seen it closer to home too. The argument that went further than it needed to. The conflict that continued long past the point where anyone remembered what started it. The commitment that became a trap you couldn't name until now. Recognize the pattern, break the cycle. If you made it this far, you understand something most people never will. Comment escalation 0 if this changed how you see conflict. You're among the very few who can now actually name the game. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up.